The winter of 1940 arrived cold and bitter in Willow Creek, Michigan, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Margaret Maggie Sullivan stood outside the newly opened aircraft factory, her breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. She clutched a folded newspaper in her gloved hand, the one with the advertisement that had changed everything. "Women needed for war production," it read. "Do your part for freedom." At 28 years old, Maggie had spent the last decade teaching third grade at Willow Creek Elementary. But her younger brother, Jimmy, had enlisted in the Army Air Corps 6 months ago, and every night since then, she had lain awake worrying about him. Teaching children their ABCs suddenly felt too small when the world was tearing itself apart across the ocean. The factory loomed before her, a massive structure of steel and glass that had gone up in just 4 months. Inside, they were building flying fortress bombers, the planes that would supposedly win the war. Maggie had read every article she could find about aviation and aircraft production. She had memorized specifications, studied blueprints at the library, and learned about riveting techniques from a manual she had mail-ordered. She was ready, or so she thought. The employment office was packed with women, most of them younger than Maggie, all of them nervous. They filled out forms, answered questions, and waited. When Maggie's turn came, she sat across from Mr. Harold Peterson, the personnel manager. He was a thick-necked man in his 50s with a cigar permanently wedged in the corner of his mouth. "Says here you're a school teacher," he said, not looking up from her application. "Yes, sir, but I'm ready to learn factory work. I've been studying." "Studying?" he chuckled, a sound like gravel shifting. "Lady, this isn't a classroom, this is hard labor, 10-hour shifts, heavy machinery, it's dangerous." "I understand that, Mr. Peterson. My brother is overseas. I want to help bring him home." Peterson finally looked up, his eyes cold and dismissive. "Look, Miss Sullivan. Miss Sullivan, we need women, sure. But we need them on the line doing simple assembly. You're a school teacher. Probably never held anything heavier than a piece of chalk. We've got quotas to meet, and I can't have some delicate flower fainting on the factory floor." Maggie felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm not delicate, sir, and I don't faint." "Tell you what," he scribbled something on her form. "I'll put you in Building C, Section 12, simple riveting work. Keep your head down, do what you're told, and maybe you'll make it through the training period. Most women don't last a month." She wanted to argue, to tell him she was capable of more, but she needed this job. She needed to contribute. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson." He waved her away without another word. The factory floor was overwhelming. The noise hit Maggie like a physical force, the screech of metal on metal, the thunder of machinery, the constant hammering of thousands of rivets being driven home. The air smelled of oil, paint, and hot metal. Everywhere she looked, people were working with intense focus, building the giant bombers one piece at a time. Her supervisor was a man named Frank Kozlowski, a barrel-chested Polish immigrant with a permanent scowl. He looked Maggie up and down when she reported for duty. "Another schoolteacher," he muttered. "They keep sending me schoolteachers and secretaries. I need workers, not ladies playing at factory work." "I'm here to work, sir," Maggie said firmly. "We'll see," he pointed to a workstation. "That's yours. Jenny over there will show you the basics. Try to keep up." Jenny Martinez was a young Mexican-American woman, barely 20, with quick hands and a kind smile. She had been working at the factory since it opened. "Don't mind Frank," Jenny said as she demonstrated the riveting technique. "He's tough on everyone at first, but he's fair. You prove yourself, he'll respect you. You mess up, though, and he'll send you packing." Maggie watched carefully as Jenny aligned 2 pieces of aluminum, positioned the rivet gun, and drove the rivet home with practiced precision. It looked simple enough. It wasn't. Her first attempt sent the rivet flying across the floor. Her second left a dent in the aluminum. By her third try, her arms were aching from the weight of the gun, and her ears were ringing despite the cotton wadding they had given her for protection. By the end of her first day, Maggie had completed maybe a quarter of the rivets Jenny had finished. Her arms felt like rubber. Her back ached. Her hands were blistered despite the gloves. She had never been so tired in her entire life. As she stumbled toward the exit, she overheard Frank talking to another supervisor. "That Sullivan woman won't last the week," Frank said. "Too soft. They all are, these society ladies thinking they can play factory worker." "Society lady?" the other man laughed. "She's a school teacher from town, not exactly high society." Same thing, no real work ethic. They want to feel patriotic without actually doing the hard work. Maggie's exhaustion was instantly replaced by anger. She thought about confronting Frank, telling him how wrong he was. But she was too tired, and she knew it would only prove his point. Instead, she went home, soaked her blistered hands in cold water, and made herself a simple dinner. That night, she received a letter from Jimmy. His handwriting was hurried, the paper stained with something that might have been coffee or mud. "Dear sis," it read, "don't know where we'll be when you get this, can't say much anyway, but I think about home every day. I think about your classroom, about Main Street, about everything we're fighting for. The guys here, we joke about the folks back home, but we need you. Every plane, every bullet, every bandage, it all matters. I'm proud of you for teaching, sis. You're shaping the future. Keep doing what you do best. Love, Jimmy." Maggie folded the letter carefully and placed it in her nightstand drawer. Jimmy thought she was still teaching. He didn't know she had left the school, that she was now struggling to prove herself in a factory where no one believed in her. She looked at her blistered hands, thought about Frank's dismissive words, Peterson's condescending attitude. Then she thought about the newspaper articles she had been collecting. The news from Europe was grim. The Nazis had conquered most of the continent. Britain stood alone, being bombed night after night. And Hermann Göring, Hitler's second-in-command and head of the Luftwaffe, had been quoted in a German newspaper mocking America's industrial claims. The article had been reprinted in the Detroit Free Press with obvious anger. "The Americans say they will build 50,000 aircraft," Göring had reportedly said, laughing at the suggestion. "This is pure fantasy. They cannot even build 5,000. They are soft, weak, interested only in their comfort. When the time comes, we will sweep them from the skis like insects." Maggie stared at that article for a long time. Soft, weak, the same words Frank had used about her, the same dismissive contempt. She made a decision that night. She would show them all, Peterson, Frank, Göring, anyone who thought Americans were too soft to fight. She would prove that determination mattered more than strength, that heart mattered more than experience. She would master this work, no matter what it took. The next morning, Maggie arrived at the factory an hour early. She found Jenny in the locker room and asked if she could watch her work before the shift started. Jenny, surprised but pleased, agreed. For 45 minutes, Maggie studied every movement, asked questions, took mental notes. When the shift began, she was ready. Her rivets were still slower than Jenny's, but they were cleaner, more precise. By the end of the day, she had completed half of Jenny's output. It still wasn't good enough, but it was progress. Frank noticed. He didn't say anything, but Maggie caught him watching her work with a slightly less hostile expression. She kept coming early, kept studying, kept pushing through the pain and exhaustion. Within 2 weeks, her output matched Jenny's. Within a month, she was one of the fastest riveters in Section 12. But that was only the beginning of her journey. Because while Maggie was proving herself on the factory floor, events were unfolding that would test not just her skill, but her courage, her loyalty, and everything she believed about justice and sacrifice. The real challenge was still ahead. 3 months into her factory work, Maggie had transformed. Her hands were calloused now, strong and sure. Her arms no longer ached at the end of each shift. She could read a blueprint as easily as she once read a children's book, and she knew the B-17 bomber inside and out, every rivet, every panel, every system. She had earned respect from most of her coworkers. Jenny had become a close friend, and even Frank Kozlowski had grudgingly admitted she was a decent worker. But there were still men in the factory who resented the women, who believed they were taking jobs that rightfully belonged to men, who made snide comments and created obstacles whenever they could. March of 1940, one brought new urgency to the work. President Roosevelt had signed the Lend-Lease Act, meaning the planes they were building would soon be going to Britain to help them fight off the Nazi bombers. Every aircraft mattered. Every delay could mean the difference between victory and defeat for the British pilots who would fly them. It was a Tuesday morning when Maggie noticed something wrong. She was working on the tail section of bomber number 417, checking the rivets along the rudder assembly, when she spotted it. One of the support brackets was misaligned by nearly a quarter inch. It was a small error, almost invisible, but Maggie had studied the engineering specifications enough to know it was wrong. "Jenny," she called to her friend, who was working 2 stations down. "Come look at this." Jenny examined the bracket, frowning. "That's not right. That could cause control problems in flight, maybe worse." "Should we report it?" "Definitely, get Frank." But when Frank inspected the work, he scowled at both of them. "It's within tolerance," he said. "Sir, the spec sheet says." "I know what the spec sheet says, Sullivan. I've been building aircraft since before you were born. This is acceptable work. Now get back to your station. We're behind schedule as it is." Maggie wanted to argue, but Jenny touched her arm, a silent warning. You didn't argue with Frank, not in front of the other workers. It made him look bad, and he wouldn't forget it. That night, Maggie couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about that misaligned bracket. Finally, she got out of bed, found her copy of the engineering specifications, and studied them by lamplight. She was right. The alignment was outside acceptable parameters. Frank was wrong. But why would he approve faulty work? Over the next 2 weeks, Maggie began paying closer attention to the assembly process. She started noticing other small errors, rivets that were slightly loose, panels that didn't quite fit, wiring that seemed marginally off specification. None of them were obvious. Any one of them might be dismissed as a minor imperfection within normal manufacturing variation, but together they formed a pattern. Someone was sabotaging the bombers. The realization sent ice through Maggie's veins. These planes were going to England. American and British pilots would fly them into combat against the Luftwaffe. If a plane had structural weaknesses or control problems, it could fail in flight. Men would die. She thought about Jimmy, about all the young men risking their lives, trusting that the equipment they were given would work properly. The idea that someone would deliberately compromise that trust made her physically ill. But who and why? The obvious answer was a German sympathizer, someone who supported the Nazis and wanted to undermine America's war production. But this was Willow Creek, Michigan, a patriotic small town where everyone displayed flags and bought war bonds. It seemed impossible. Maggie decided to document what she was finding. She began keeping careful notes, recording every error she spotted, which plane it was on, which work crew had assembled that section. She took the notes home each night and hid them in her bedroom. After 3 weeks of investigation, a pattern emerged. Almost all of the errors occurred in sections that had been inspected or supervised by Frank Kozlowski. It couldn't be. Frank was tough and demanding, but he was a hard worker, a man who took pride in his job. He had been with the company since the factory opened. He couldn't be a saboteur. But the evidence was there in black and white. Maggie faced an impossible decision. If she was wrong, if she accused Frank based on circumstantial evidence, she would destroy an innocent man's career and probably lose her own job. Peterson would use it as proof that women were too emotional and unreliable for factory work. But if she was right and she said nothing, those faulty planes would be shipped to England. Men would die because she had been too afraid to speak up. She thought about what she would tell her students if they faced a moral dilemma. She had always taught them that doing the right thing required courage, that standing up for truth was more important than being popular or safe. Now she had to follow her own advice. Maggie went to Peterson's office on a Friday afternoon after her shift ended. She brought her notebook, her documentation, her carefully recorded evidence. Peterson listened to her report with growing impatience. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "Let me get this straight," he said. "You're accusing Frank Kozlowski, one of my best supervisors, of sabotage. Based on what? A bunch of measurements that you, a former schoolteacher with 4 months of factory experience, think are wrong." "I've checked the specifications, sir. These measurements are outside acceptable parameters." "Have you considered that maybe you're reading the specifications wrong? That maybe you don't understand manufacturing tolerances as well as you think you do?" "I've considered that, but..." "Frank Kozlowski has been building aircraft for 20 years. He's forgotten more about aircraft assembly than you'll ever know. And you're questioning his work." Maggie felt her face flush. "Sir, I'm not questioning his expertise. I'm saying that something is wrong. Maybe he's not responsible. Maybe someone is sabotaging his sections and he hasn't noticed. But we need to investigate." Peterson stood up, his face hard. "Let me tell you something, Miss Sullivan. Since we started hearing women, productivity has gone down and complaints have gone up. You know why? Because women bring drama into the workplace. They see conspiracies where there are none. They get emotional instead of focusing on the job." "This isn't emotion, sir. This is evidence." "Evidence?" He snatched her notebook and flipped through it dismissively. "This is paranoia. Frank Kozlowski is a loyal American. His son is in the Navy, for God's sake. The idea that he would sabotage the planes his own son might someday need is insulting. Maggie hadn't known Frank had a son in the service. The information shook her certainty, but only for a moment. Then let's inspect the planes I've identified. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize to Frank personally, but if I'm right. You're not right, you're a woman who's gotten too big for her britches. Peterson dropped her notebook on the desk. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take this notebook home, burn it, and forget this foolishness. You're going to go back to your riveting station, do your job, and keep your mouth shut. If I hear that you've been spreading these accusations around the factory, you're fired. Understood. Maggie stared at him, speechless. She had expected skepticism, even dismissal, but not this wall of absolute refusal. I need an answer, Miss Sullivan. Do you understand? I understand that you're refusing to investigate a potential safety issue that could cost men their lives. Peterson's face turned red. Get out of my office, now, before I fire you on the spot. Maggie left, her hands shaking with anger and frustration. She had done the right thing, and she had been dismissed as an hysterical woman. Peterson hadn't even looked at her evidence properly. He had made up his mind before she finished speaking. That night she sat at her kitchen table, staring at her notebook. Peterson had told her to burn it, to forget everything she had discovered, to stay quiet and compliant. She thought about Hermann Göring again, mocking America as soft and weak. She thought about Frank dismissing her as a delicate flower who couldn't handle real work. She thought about Peterson treating her concerns as female hysteria. They all expected her to give up, to back down, to accept her place and stop causing trouble. Maggie opened her notebook and continued documenting the evidence. If Peterson wouldn't listen, she would find someone who would. She didn't know how yet, but she wasn't giving up. Too much was at stake. The bombers kept rolling off the production line, dozens each week, heading to England where desperate pilots waited for them. And hidden among those planes, disguised as normal manufacturing variations, were the small sabotages that could turn a weapon of freedom into a death trap. Maggie lay awake that night, knowing that somewhere across the Atlantic, her brother Jimmy was depending on people like her to do their jobs right. She couldn't let him down. She couldn't let any of them down. But she was alone now, with evidence no one would believe, facing enemies she couldn't identify, in a fight she didn't know how to win. The only thing she knew for certain was that she wasn't going to quit. April 1941 brought rain to Willow Creek, a cold drizzle that turned the factory parking lot into a maze of puddles and mud. Maggie had been keeping her head down for 2 weeks, following Peterson's orders to focus on her work and forget her suspicions. But every day, she saw more bombers rolling off the line, and every day she wondered which ones carried hidden flaws. She continued documenting the errors in secret, but she felt helpless. What good was evidence if no one would look at it? The answer arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in the form of Captain James Holland. Captain Holland was an Army Air Corps officer sent by the War Department to conduct random quality inspections of aircraft production facilities. He was a tall, lean man in his late 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. When Peterson was informed of the inspection, his face went pale. These inspections are supposed to be announced in advance, Peterson complained to his assistant, loud enough for the workers nearby to hear. This is highly irregular. Army doesn't have to announce anything, the assistant replied. War Department wants to make sure production standards are being met. Can't do that if everyone knows they're coming. Maggie was riveting a wing panel when she heard the news. Her heart began to race. This was the chance she had been waiting for. Captain Holland was an outsider, someone who wasn't part of the factory politics, someone who would have to take quality concerns seriously. But how could she get to him? Peterson would never let her near the inspection team, especially after their confrontation. And if she tried to approach Holland directly, Peterson would probably fire her on the spot. She needed a plan. During her lunch break, Maggie watched Captain Holland's inspection team work their way through the factory floor. They were thorough, checking measurements, testing rivets, examining welds. Holland himself moved with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. Jenny sat down next to Maggie with her lunch pail. That Army captain is really putting everyone on edge, she said. Frank's been nervous all morning, Peterson too. Good, Maggie said quietly. Maybe they should be nervous. Jenny gave her a sharp look. You're still thinking about those measurements, aren't you? Maggie let it go. You tried to report it. Peterson shut you down. There's nothing more you can do. There's always something more you can do, Maggie said. You just have to find it. That afternoon, Captain Holland's team reached Section 12. Maggie watched them examine several completed bomber sections, including some of the ones she had documented in her notebook. Holland frowned at a tail assembly, took measurements, made notes. He asked Frank several questions, his tone neutral but probing. Frank answered confidently, but Maggie noticed a tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes. As the inspection team moved on, Holland paused near Maggie's workstation. He was examining the wing panel she had just finished, running his hand along the rivet line. "This is excellent work," he said, not looking at her. "Clean, precise, properly aligned, better than some I've seen today." "Thank you, sir," Maggie replied. He glanced at her then, really seeing her for the first time. "How long have you been doing this?" "4 months, sir." His eyebrows rose slightly. 4 months, and you're already this skilled. That's impressive. "I studied before I started, sir, and I pay attention to the specifications." Something in the way she emphasized the word specifications made Holland pause. He looked at her more carefully, his eyes sharp and assessing. "The specifications are important," he said slowly. "They're what keep our pilots safe." "Yes, sir, I think about that every day. My brother is in the Army Air Corps." "Then you understand how much depends on getting every detail right." "I do, sir, more than some people realize." There was a weighted pause. Holland was studying her face now, clearly sensing that she was trying to communicate something beyond the surface conversation. "Captain Holland," Peterson's voice cut across the factory floor. He was hurrying toward them, his face anxious. "Is there a problem here?" "No problem," Holland said mildly. "Just complimenting this worker on her craftsmanship." "Yes, well, we should continue the inspection. Lots to see, and I know your time is valuable." Peterson practically herded Holland away from Maggie's station. But as Holland left, he glanced back at her, and Maggie saw understanding in his eyes. He knew she had been trying to tell him something. Now she just had to figure out how to finish the conversation. The opportunity came that evening. Maggie had stayed late, volunteering for overtime to finish a rush order. Most of the workers had gone home. The factory was quiet except for the skeleton night crew. As she was leaving through the main entrance, she saw Captain Holland standing outside in the parking lot, looking up at the massive factory building. His inspection team had left, but he had apparently remained behind. He was smoking a cigarette, his face thoughtful in the dim light. Maggie hesitated. This might be her only chance, but approaching him could cost her everything. Peterson had made it clear what would happen if she continued pushing her accusations. She thought about Jimmy. She thought about the pilots in England, waiting for planes they could trust with their lives. She thought about Hermann Göring's mocking laughter. She walked over to Captain Holland. "Sir, I need to speak with you. It's important." He turned, recognizing her from the factory floor. "The riveter with the brother in the Air Corps." "Yes, sir, my name is Margaret Sullivan." She took a deep breath. "I have evidence of sabotage in the aircraft production line. I tried to report it to Mr. Peterson, but he refused to investigate. I need you to look at what I've found." Holland's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "That's a serious accusation." "Yes, sir, I know, and I have serious evidence." She pulled her notebook from her handbag. "I've been documenting quality control failures for the past 6 weeks. Small errors, easy to miss individually, but they form a pattern. Someone is deliberately introducing defects into the bombers." Holland took the notebook and began reading through it by the light of the parking lot lamps. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the air cold and damp. Maggie waited, her heart pounding. After several long minutes, Holland looked up. "You documented all of this yourself?" "Yes, sir." "And you're certain these measurements are outside specification?" "I've checked and double-checked, sir. I know I'm just a factory worker and I only have 4 months of experience, but I was a teacher before this. I know how to research. I know how to verify information." "A teacher?" Holland studied her face. "What made you leave teaching for factory work?" "I wanted to help win the war, sir. I wanted to do something that mattered." "Teaching matters." "Yes, sir, but this felt more urgent." Holland was quiet for a moment, looking at the notebook again. Then he said, "You understand what will happen if you're wrong? Peterson will fire you. You'll probably never work in a factory again. The men here will say you were hysterical, that women can't handle the pressure. I understand, sir, but I'm not wrong. And if you're right, if there really is sabotage, Holland's voice was hard now, then we have a traitor in this factory, someone who's willing to kill American and British pilots, someone who needs to be caught and punished. Are you prepared for what that investigation might uncover? Are you prepared to testify to face whoever is responsible? Maggie met his eyes steadily. My brother is overseas, sir. If he has to fly a compromised aircraft because I was too afraid to speak up, I couldn't live with myself. So yes, sir, I'm prepared. Holland nodded slowly. All right, Miss Sullivan, I'm going to look into this. But I need you to promise me something. Don't tell anyone about this conversation. Don't mention your suspicions to anyone. If there is a saboteur, we don't want to alert them that we're investigating. I won't say anything, sir. Good, go home, act normal, I'll be in touch. He handed back her notebook. Keep documenting, but be careful. If someone is willing to sabotage aircraft, they might be willing to do worse to protect themselves. The warning sent a chill down Maggie's spine, but she nodded. I understand. As she walked to her car, Maggie felt a mixture of relief and fear. Finally, someone was taking her seriously. Finally, there would be a real investigation. But Holland was right about the danger. If there was a saboteur and if they realized she was onto them, she could be in real trouble. She drove home through the dark streets of Willow Creek, checking her rearview mirror more often than usual, jumping at shadows. Inside her small house, she made sure all the doors and windows were locked. Then she sat at her kitchen table and continued adding to her documentation, recording every detail she could remember from the day's work. Somewhere in Willow Creek, a traitor was sleeping soundly, confident that their sabotage had gone undetected. But not for much longer. The investigation was beginning, and Maggie was determined to see it through, no matter what it cost her. She thought about her students, about the lessons she had taught them about courage and integrity. She had always told them that standing up for what was right wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Now she was living those lessons, and she was discovering just how hard they really were. But she wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. Captain Holland worked fast. Within 3 days of Maggie's revelation, he had returned to the factory with a specialized team from the Army Air Corps Quality Assurance Division. They arrived quietly, without fanfare, setting up in an unused office space that Peterson was forced to provide. Peterson was furious, but he couldn't refuse to cooperate with a military investigation. He stalked around the factory with a thunderous expression, snapping at workers and supervisors alike. Frank Kozlowski seemed tense but not particularly worried. That bothered Maggie. If Frank was the saboteur, shouldn't he be more nervous about the investigation? Unless he wasn't the saboteur at all. The thought struck Maggie like a lightning bolt. What if she had been wrong about Frank? What if the pattern in her data was misleading her? She had assumed that because the errors appeared in sections Frank supervised, he must be responsible. But what if someone was framing him? What if the real saboteur was someone else entirely, someone who wanted Frank to take the blame? She went back through her notebook that night, looking at the data with fresh eyes. Frank supervised 3 work crews, about 45 people total. Any one of them could have introduced the defects. Frank couldn't watch everyone all the time. Maggie started making a list of everyone who worked in Frank's sections, noting who had been present when each error occurred. It was tedious work, requiring her to remember details from weeks earlier, cross-referencing her notes with the crew schedules. A pattern emerged, but it wasn't the one she expected. There was one worker who had been present for almost every documented error. Not Frank, not any of the other supervisors. A man named Walter Schmidt, a middle-aged toolmaker who had been with the factory since the beginning. Walter Schmidt. Maggie realized she knew almost nothing about him. He was quiet, competent, kept to himself. She tried to remember if she had ever had a real conversation with him. She didn't think so. The next morning, she requested a meeting with Captain Holland. He met her in the makeshift office after her shift, listening carefully as she explained her new theory. Walter Schmidt, Holland said, writing the name down. What do you know about him? Not much, sir. He's quiet, good at his job. I don't think he has family in town. At least he never mentions anyone. And you think he's been deliberately framing Frank Kozlowski? I think it's possible, sir. Frank is an obvious target. He's the supervisor. If something goes wrong, people naturally blame him. but Walter works in all three of Frank's crews. He moves around, helps different teams with their tools. He'd have access to every section where we found problems. Holland drummed his fingers on the desk, thinking, "It's thin, we need more." "I know, sir, but maybe we could watch him, see if he does anything suspicious." "We're already conducting surveillance," Holland said, "but we've been focused on the supervisors. I'll have my team add Schmidt to the watch list." He paused. "Miss Sullivan, I want you to be very careful. If Schmidt is our saboteur and if he realizes we're onto him, he might do something desperate." "I'll be careful, sir." But being careful wasn't going to be enough. Maggie knew that if they wanted to catch Walter Schmidt, if he was indeed the saboteur, they needed to force him to make a mistake. They needed to set a trap. She spent the next 2 days thinking about how to do that. Finally, she came up with an idea. It was risky, and Holland wasn't going to like it, but it might work. That evening, she went to Holland's office again. "I want to be bait," she said without preamble. Holland looked up from his paperwork, frowning. "Absolutely not." "Hear me out, sir. If Walter is the saboteur, he's careful. He's been getting away with this for months. He's not going to slip up just because we're watching him. But if he thinks someone is onto him, specifically me, he might panic. He might make a mistake. Or he might hurt you. Not if your team is watching. Sir, we need to end this. Every day we wait, more planes go out with potential defects. More lives are at risk." Holland studied her for a long moment. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Tomorrow, during lunch break, I'm going to have a conversation with Jenny Martinez, loud enough for Walter to overhear. I'm going to tell Jenny that I've figured out who the saboteur is, that I'm meeting with you tomorrow evening to give you proof. If Walter is guilty, he'll have to act. He can't risk me exposing him. And if he tries to hurt you, your men will be there to stop him, and we'll have our proof." Holland shook his head. "It's too dangerous." "Sir, with respect, danger is part of this war. My brother is facing danger every day overseas. The least I can do is face some danger here at home." "Your brother is a trained soldier. And I'm a woman who's smart enough to catch a saboteur that everyone else missed," Maggie said firmly. "I can do this, sir. I need to do this." Holland sighed, clearly torn. Finally, he said, "If we do this, and I mean if you follow my instructions exactly, my men will be covering you every second. The first sign of real danger, we pull you out. Understood?" "Understood, sir." They spent the next hour planning every detail. Holland would have 3 men stationed near the factory, watching for any sign that Walter was following Maggie or planning something. Maggie would leave the factory at her normal time, drive her normal route home, but she would stop at the library, a public place where Holland's men could maintain visual contact while giving Walter an opportunity to approach her. "If he's going to make a move, it will probably be somewhere between the factory and your house," Holland said. "Somewhere isolated but not too isolated. He won't want witnesses, but he won't want to risk a prolonged confrontation either." The plan terrified Maggie, but she was determined. This war wasn't just being fought in Europe and the Pacific. It was being fought here too, in the factories and shipyards, in the hearts and minds of people who had to choose between safety and duty. She had made her choice months ago when she walked into that factory for the first time. She wasn't going to back down now. The next day, everything went according to plan. During lunch, Maggie sat with Jenny in the cafeteria. She made sure they were at a table near where Walter Schmidt usually ate. "I can't believe it," Maggie said, loud enough to carry but not so loud that it seemed obvious. "All this time, and I finally figured out who's been sabotaging the planes." Jenny, who had been briefed on the plan, played her part perfectly. "Are you sure, Maggie, that's serious?" "I'm positive. I've been documenting everything. I'm meeting with Captain Holland tonight to show him the evidence. Finally, we'll have proof." Out of the corner of her eye, Maggie saw Walter Schmidt stiffen. He was 3 tables away, eating alone as usual. His hands stopped moving. His head tilted slightly, just enough to indicate he was listening. Maggie felt her heart rate accelerate, but she kept her voice steady. "I just hope they catch him before he can do any more damage. Who knows how many planes he's compromised already." "What time are you meeting the captain?" Jenny asked. 6 o'clock, right after my shift." Maggie stood up, gathering her lunch pail. "I need to get back to work. I'll tell you everything tomorrow after Holland makes the arrest." She walked away, resisting the urge to look back at Walter. Either the trap had worked, or she had just wasted everyone's time. She would find out soon enough. The afternoon dragged by with excruciating slowness. Every time Maggie looked up from her work, she found herself scanning the factory floor for Walter Schmidt. He was there, moving between workstations as usual, his expression neutral. If he was planning anything, he gave no sign of it. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe Walter wasn't the saboteur after all. Maybe. Her shift ended at 5:30. Maggie gathered her things, said goodbye to Jenny, and walked out to the parking lot. Her hands were shaking as she unlocked her car. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to act natural. Captain Holland's men were out there somewhere, watching. She was safe. This was going to work. She drove toward town, following her normal route. The library was 10 minutes from the factory, on a quiet street lined with maple trees. She parked in the lot, grabbed her handbag, and walked toward the entrance. She was halfway across the parking lot when she heard footsteps behind her, moving fast. "Miss Sullivan," a voice called, Walter Schmidt's voice. "Wait, I need to talk to you." Maggie turned. Walter was approaching quickly, his face flushed, his eyes darting nervously. He was alone. Where were Holland's men? "Walter," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "what can I do for you?" "You can stop," he said. He was close now, too close. She could smell the machine oil and sweat on him. "You can stop asking questions, stop investigating, stop ruining everything." "I don't know what you mean," Maggie said, backing up. "Don't play stupid with me. I heard you at lunch. You think you figured something out. You think you're smart." His hand moved to his jacket pocket. "You're not smart. You're just a nosy woman who doesn't know when to quit." "Walter, think about what you're doing." "I've thought plenty. You want to know why I did it, why I sabotaged those planes." His face twisted with anger. "Because this isn't our war. We shouldn't be sending weapons to help the British. We shouldn't be preparing to fight Germany. My family came from Germany, good people, hard-working people, and now we're supposed to bomb them, kill them, for what?" "For freedom," Maggie said. "For people who can't defend themselves." "That's propaganda. The British are no better than the Germans. They have colonies, they oppress people. But nobody talks about that, do they?" Walter's hand came out of his pocket. He was holding a wrench, heavy and iron. "I'm not going to let you ruin this. I'm not going to let you send me to prison for doing what's right." He raised the wrench. Maggie opened her mouth to scream, but before any sound came out, 3 men in civilian clothes emerged from behind nearby cars. They moved with military precision, surrounding Walter in seconds. "Drop the weapon," Captain Holland said, appearing from behind Maggie. His voice was ice cold. "Drop it now, or I'll have my men shoot you where you stand." Walter looked around wildly, seeing the trap close. His hand loosened. The wrench clattered to the pavement. "Walter Schmidt, you're under arrest for sabotage, attempted assault, and treason," Holland said. 2 of his men grabbed Walter's arms, forcing them behind his back. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." As Walter was led away, still protesting his innocence, his anger, his twisted justification, Maggie felt her legs go weak. She sat down hard on the curb, her whole body shaking. Holland knelt beside her. "You did well, Miss Sullivan, very well. Are you all right?" "I think so," Maggie whispered. "Is it over?" "The danger is over. The investigation is just beginning." Holland helped her to her feet. "We'll need your testimony, your documentation. This is going to be a major case." Maggie nodded numbly. She had done it. She had caught the saboteur. She had protected the pilots, protected her brother, protected everyone who depended on those planes. But as the adrenaline faded, she realized the real challenges were just beginning. She had made powerful enemies in this factory. She had proven that women could do more than follow orders. She had changed everything. The arrest of Walter Schmidt sent shockwaves through the Willow Creek factory. Within days, the story had spread through the entire town. A German sympathizer sabotaging the planes meant to defeat Hitler, and a woman, a former schoolteacher, who had caught him when all the men had missed the signs. The reactions were mixed. Some people called Maggie a hero. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with her photograph, titled "Willow Creek Woman Stops Factory Saboteur." Churches mentioned her in their prayers. Women on the street thanked her for her courage. But others resented her. Men in the factory muttered that she was an uppity troublemaker who had gotten lucky. Some said she had exaggerated the danger to get attention. A few even suggested that she had somehow set Walter up, that a man couldn't possibly be that stupid unless a scheming woman had trapped him. Harold Peterson was forced to issue a public apology for not investigating Maggie's initial report. It was a brief, grudging statement that made it clear he had been pressured into it by the War Department. When Maggie saw him in the factory after that, his eyes were full of cold hatred. Frank Kozlowski, on the other hand, sought her out personally. "Sullivan," he said one morning, his gruff voice softer than usual, "I owe you an apology. When you started here, I thought you were just another soft society woman playing at war work. I was wrong. You're tougher than half the men in this place. Thank you for clearing my name." Maggie was surprised by the emotion in his voice. "You didn't need clearing, Frank. You weren't guilty of anything." "No, but I was guilty of being blind. Schmidt worked under my supervision for months. I should have seen something. You saw it. That takes real skill." He held out his hand. "Friends." Maggie shook his hand. "Friends." Captain Holland's investigation uncovered the full extent of Walter Schmidt's sabotage. Over the course of 6 months, he had introduced defects into 43 aircraft. Of those, 17 had already been shipped to England. Holland's team worked around the clock to identify which planes were compromised and notify the British military so the aircraft could be grounded and repaired before anyone was hurt. Thanks to Maggie's documentation, they found every single affected plane. No pilot died because of Walter Schmidt's sabotage. It was, Holland told her, a remarkable achievement. Walter Schmidt himself was tried in a closed military tribunal. He was found guilty of sabotage and treason and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. At the sentencing, he showed no remorse, insisting he had been right to try to prevent America from entering the war. But America was entering the war, whether Walter Schmidt liked it or not, and Maggie Sullivan was going to be part of it. In July 1941, just 3 months after Walter's arrest, the factory increased production dramatically. President Roosevelt had called for even more aircraft, more weapons, more everything. The Germans were advancing into Russia. The Japanese were threatening Southeast Asia. The world was on fire, and America was the only nation with the industrial capacity to provide the weapons needed to fight back. Maggie was promoted, not to supervisor, Peterson made sure of that, but to quality control inspector, a position that let her use her eye for detail and her knowledge of specifications. She moved through the factory floor with authority now, checking work, identifying problems before they became dangerous. She trained other women, teaching them not just how to rivet or weld, but how to think critically, how to spot errors, how to take pride in their work. She became known as someone who got results, someone who didn't accept good enough when perfect was possible. More women joined the factory workforce. By autumn, almost 30% of the workers were women. They called themselves Rosie the Riveters, taking pride in their contribution to the war effort. Maggie became an unofficial leader among them, someone they came to with problems, someone who showed them that women belonged in the factories as much as men did. And the planes kept coming, dozens each week, then hundreds, B-17s, B-24s, fighter planes, transport planes. The factory expanded, adding new buildings, new production lines. Willow Creek transformed from a sleepy small town into a bustling industrial center. On December 7, 1941, everything changed. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America declared war. Suddenly, the factory work wasn't just preparation anymore. It was real, urgent, desperate. Every plane mattered. Every rivet mattered. Every hour mattered. Maggie worked overtime almost every night. She barely slept. Her hands were constantly sore, her back always aching, but she never complained. None of them did. They all knew what was at stake. Jimmy wrote from somewhere in the Pacific, his letters censored but still full of his personality. "The planes are good, sis," one letter said. "Really good. Someone back home is doing their job right. Thank them for me." Maggie cried when she read that, knowing that some of those planes had come from her factory, that her work was directly helping keep her brother alive. In 1942, production reached levels that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. The factory that had struggled to build a dozen planes a month was now producing hundreds. And it wasn't just Willow Creek. Factories across America were ramping up, hearing women running 3 shifts, working miracles of production. Hermann Göring's mocking laughter seemed very distant now. Maggie read the war news obsessively. She followed the battles in Europe, in Africa, in the Pacific. She learned the names of the generals, the strategies, the victories and defeats. And she noticed something that the newspapers didn't always emphasize. The Luftwaffe, Göring's supposedly invincible air force, was being overwhelmed. Not by superior tactics or better pilots, but by simple numbers. American planes were everywhere, bombers over Germany, fighters in Italy, transports bringing supplies to Russia. The flood of aircraft was relentless, unstoppable. In 1943, the tide of war began to turn. Allied bombers, many of them built in American factories, began systematic raids on German cities and industrial centers. The Germans fought back fiercely, but they couldn't match the production coming from America. For every plane Germany built, America built 10. By 1944, the number reached the unthinkable. Not 50,000 planes, as Roosevelt had promised in 1940, 100,000 planes, and more were coming every single day. Maggie was inspecting a B-17 on the assembly line in June 1944 when she heard the news. D-Day. Allied forces had landed in Normandy. American, British, and Canadian troops were fighting their way into Hitler's Europe, and above them, providing cover, attacking German positions, were thousands of American aircraft. She stood there on the factory floor, surrounded by the thunder of machinery, the smell of oil and metal, the sound of thousands of riveters doing their jobs, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. They were winning, America was winning, democracy was winning. And women like her, former schoolteachers and secretaries and housewives, had made it possible. The war continued for another year, brutal and costly, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany's industry was being bombed into rubble. Japan's military was being pushed back island by island, and the flood of American production never stopped. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. Maggie was at work when the announcement came over the factory loudspeakers. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then someone cheered. Then everyone was cheering, crying, hugging each other. The war in Europe was over. Jimmy came home in August after Japan surrendered. He was thinner, older, marked by things he wouldn't talk about. But he was alive. When Maggie picked him up from the train station, he grabbed her in a fierce hug. "I heard what you did," he said. "Catching that saboteur, making sure the planes were safe. Maggie, you saved lives, maybe mine." "I just did my job," she said, crying now. "No, you did more than that. You showed everyone what women can do. You changed things." He was right. The war had changed everything. Women had proven they could work in factories, fly planes, serve in the military, do anything that needed doing. There would be people who tried to push them back into traditional roles after the war, but it would never be the same. The door had been opened, and it couldn't be closed again. A month after Jimmy came home, the factory held a ceremony. They were honoring the workers who had contributed the most to the war effort. Maggie was surprised to be called up to the platform. Captain Holland, now promoted to major, presented her with a civilian citation from the War Department. "For exceptional service to the United States during wartime," he read. Margaret Sullivan identified and prevented sabotage that could have cost dozens of Allied lives. Her dedication, courage, and skill exemplify the best of American industrial workers. The factory workers applauded. Even Peterson, standing to one side, managed a grudging nod of respect. But the moment Maggie treasured most came afterward, when she was surrounded by young women from the factory, all of them asking questions, wanting to know how she had the courage to speak up, how she had learned to do her job so well. "You just do the right thing," Maggie told them. "Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, you find the courage inside yourself and you use it. And you remember that you're not doing it for yourself. You're doing it for everyone who depends on you." One young woman, barely 20, looked at Maggie with shining eyes. "I want to be like you," she said, "strong and brave." Maggie smiled. "You already are, all of you are. You came here when your country needed you. You worked harder than you thought you could. You proved that women can do anything. Be proud of that." That night, Maggie sat in her living room with Jimmy, drinking coffee and talking about ordinary things: the weather, the neighbors, plans for Thanksgiving. The war was over. Life was returning to normal. But Maggie knew she would never be the same person she had been before. The shy schoolteacher who had been afraid to speak up, who had accepted being dismissed and underestimated, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth, someone who would never again let anyone tell her she was too soft, too weak, too delicate. She thought about Hermann Göring, sitting in a prison cell now, waiting to be tried for war crimes. He had mocked America's dream of 50,000 planes. He had called Americans soft and weak. He had been wrong, catastrophically, completely wrong. America had built not 50,000 planes, but 100,000, and then kept building. By the war's end, the number would exceed 300,000 aircraft. They had thundered over Europe, over Africa, over the Pacific. They had bombed German cities, escorted Allied bombers, transported supplies, evacuated wounded soldiers, and done 1,000 other tasks. They had been the difference between victory and defeat. And women like Maggie Sullivan had helped build every single one of them. She had started this journey trying to prove she wasn't soft. She had ended it proving that strength came in many forms. It came from working through pain and exhaustion. It came from speaking truth when others wanted silence. It came from doing what was right even when it was dangerous. Most of all, it came from caring enough to fight for something bigger than yourself. Maggie had done that, they all had, and they had won. The thunderstorm over Europe had passed, and in its wake the world was changed forever. Retry.